Number 10. The seven-headed figure. There is a very strange figure that has been found all across the world, from ancient Siberia all the way to the oldest cultures of India. It's a petroglyph of a mysterious being with 2 arms, 2 legs, and 7 heads branching out from a very long neck. It was first discovered in the Caucasia region of Siberia. According to the experts, it dates back 5,000 years. And while some claim it has something to do with astrology, it might be something altogether different we can't even hope to comprehend. Let's take a look at the Hindu goddess Manasa, who is depicted as an ordinary woman with a couple of extra arms and 7 cobra heads fanning out behind her ordinary head. It may not look exactly the same as the petroglyph from Siberia, but it's the same basic idea, a great deity with 7 heads. Moving on to Hinduism, we find beings with 7 heads all throughout ancient mythology too. Even the Greek hero Hercules had to slay the Hydra, which is a beast with 7 heads. Cultures from Mongolia to Iran all had some kind of monster with the same amount of heads, and they were almost always serpent heads. Even in Mexico, a sculpture has been found depicting a popular deity with 7 snake heads. This was found in Veracruz. It's the Aztec goddess of fertility, Aparicio. Even more bizarre is that the figures with their 7 snake heads are often female. It's one thing when all these cultures came up with the idea for a 7-headed god. It's beyond coincidence they all chose to make them female. Why? Well, nobody knows. Number 9. The Great Flood. There has been a lot of speculation over the story about a flood washing over the earth. In the Bible, there was a great flood that washed over the earth, causing Noah to build his ark and rescue all the animals. But did the flood really happen? According to a few ancient coincidences, it just might have. The thing is that in almost every ancient culture, there's a story of a flood. And if scholars are to be believed, those who wrote the stories, or at least passed them along, were speaking of an actual flooding event. Which cultures talk about the Great Flood? How about the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, and the Assyrians? The Great Flood is spoken of in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Bible, and the Sumerian creation myth. But the flood is also spoken of in texts from other parts of the world, like in Hindu mythology, in which Vishnu warns the very first man on Earth that there's an impending flood and that he should build a giant boat. But there are even more obscure ancient religions that spoke of a flood. For example, in the relatively unknown yet very ancient Zoroastrian Mazdaism, Ahiram attempts to destroy the world using a drought, and the hero Mithra starts a flood to save the world, but only one man survives inside an ark filled with his cattle. In other words, just about every ancient culture in the world talked about a flood. The consensus is that there probably was one. Number 8. Pinecone Symbol. Pine cones have been around for a long time, about as long as pine trees. Well, pine cones may be more than just crunchy brown things littering the forest floor. The pine cone also represents the third eye, the pineal gland, and human enlightenment. As hard as this is to believe, it may actually be true. The pine cone has been found all throughout the ancient world and is seen so often and in so many cultures that it just can't be a coincidence. Let's start with the Egyptian staff of Osiris. This artifact dates back to 1224 BCE and shows 2 serpents spiraling around the center staff to meet a pine cone at the top. There's no mistaking the pinecone symbol for anything else. It's a unique shape and texture. There are also Hindu deities depicted with pine cones. There are countless sculptures in which a deity is grasping what appears to be a pine cone. Then there's Shiva, whose hair is actually coiled in the exact shape of a pine cone. But what do all these coincidences mean? Why is there a pine cone on the Vatican flag and even on the sacred staff that the Pope carries? One of the prevailing theories is that the pine cone really does represent the human third eye and the secret of enlightenment, something our ancient ancestors understood and that we have since lost. What do you think? Is a pine cone just a pine cone, or is it so much more? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're liking the video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 7. The Ancient Swastika. Speaking of ancient symbols, The swastika is, without a doubt, the most controversial symbol in the world. It's a thing that today represents hate and evil thanks to that Hitler guy. But long before Hitler ever showed his ugly mug, the swastika was seen all over the planet in different cultures. In Sanskrit, the swastika was the symbol for well-being. It was used by Hindus and Buddhists, and even adopted by the USA pre-World War II. Back when Coca-Cola was still 5 cents, it was advertised on swastika-shaped bottle openers. Did you know the swastika was even used by the Boy Scouts and the Girls Club of America? At this point, you might be thinking the swastika isn't a coincidence at all, since it's been seen in all the same religions from India to Japan. But in fact, there is an ivory figure of a bird in the National Museum of History in Ukraine made from the tusk of a mammoth, and yes, it was found engraved with the swastika. The figurine was discovered near the Russian border inside the remains of an ancient Paleolithic settlement from 15,000 years ago. According to the BBC, experts believe the swastika was seen as a fertility symbol. It's one of the oldest and most widespread symbols in human history, and nobody's really sure why. Number 6. Lost technology. At megaliths across the world, archaeologists have found proof of ancient metal clamps. Evidence of this old and mysterious technology has been discovered at temples, prehistoric monuments, and anywhere ancient people built their structures. The evidence comes in the form of molds that were once used to probably form clamps of metal to help in building. These molds were found in Egypt, Peru, and even Cambodia. The big coincidence is that the same technology has been found at all these random points across the globe. How do we know these clamps were actually used? Well, because their imprints are still around today. There are distinct impressions in the stone at ancient sites that look as though they'd been used to hold huge blocks of rock together. In South America, many of these clips were apparently stolen by the Spanish who thought they were crafted from gold. The rest have been lost, just like nearly all the ancient technologies of the world. Some have speculated that aliens actually came down and gifted this metal technology to all the ancient societies, giving them a jumpstart that would lead to complex cities and structures. With the ability to fix together huge blocks of stone using metal clamps, different cultures were able to make impressive buildings that still leave us in awe. Number 5. Pyramids everywhere. When it comes to ancient coincidences, there's nothing more curious than the pyramid. And while most famous pyramids are of course those in Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico and Central America, there are actually pyramids built in other locations all over the world. Many of the pyramids are built in rows of 3 and line up with the constellations. There are pyramids in Greece, known as the Pyramids of Argolis. They were constructed sometime between 2000 BCE and 400 BCE. Then there's the Pyramid of Cestuus in Italy, crafted in the year 18 BCE. We have the shocking Kushite pyramids in Sudan that were built by the ancient culture of Nubia, with many of them even older than those in Egypt. In fact, there are over 255 pyramids in Sudan alone. Why were so many ancient cultures building pyramids, especially ones that didn't have any contact with one another? There have been pyramids discovered in Indonesia, Peru, Cambodia, and even in Cahokia in the United States. Did all of these ancient civilizations think of building pyramids on their own? Or were they inspired by something that appeared to all of them, perhaps from another world? What do you think? Number 4. Rome and Rio. Artifacts that came from ancient Rome were found in a bay in Rio de Janeiro. What's really strange is that the Romans never even made it to Brazil. Nevertheless, the artifacts originated 17 centuries before Portuguese explorers ever entered the region. These artifacts were from 2,000 years before European eyes ever saw South America. So what exactly are Roman artifacts doing at the bottom of Guanabara Bay, only 50 miles or 80 kilometers from Rio? Did the Romans truly conquer the world, being the first ones to reach South America? The best theory is that the Romans' ship got lost in the ocean and then sank in the bay, though it is impossible to say whether the Romans themselves ever made it to ground. Underwater archaeologist Robert Marks, who specializes in sunken treasure and early exploration, believes the Roman vessel probably anchored in the bay and then was blown into the reef and destroyed, leaving a small dispatch of Romans abandoned in Brazil. This could obviously have a lot of implications. Did the Romans settle in the area? Did they interact with the natives? And if so, does this mean the ancient South Americans knew about Europe, but the Europeans didn't know about them? It's really quite an interesting concept, and one that's probably true. After all, there were dozens of Roman amphorae jars found. The jars were used for carrying wine and oil on long voyages. It only makes sense that they came from a shipwreck. And it's doubtful all the Romans on board perished just a few miles from the coast. They almost certainly made it to the shore. Number 3. Designer handbags. All across the globe, there are mysterious statues that seem to show ancient cultures worshipping a designer handbag. There are statues from Mesopotamia, New Zealand, and Egypt, just to name a few, with some allegedly going back up to 10,000 years. Now, none of this has been scientifically confirmed by any major scientists, but the proof is still there. After all, you can't really fake ancient statues. But just what is this mysterious handbag seen all over the world? Even more importantly, could it possibly be proof of time travel? The handbags depicted in the statues and motifs are almost always being held by one ancient deity or another. They don't seem to contain anything physical, but they are obviously handbags. Some claim the bags are supposed to contain all the knowledge of the particular god. In other words, cosmic knowledge that is unavailable to ordinary people. This has led some to speculate that the gods worshipped by these ancient civilizations were real, and that they brought secret knowledge with them from the stars. This knowledge, evidently, is contained inside these handbags. Either that or their gods had somehow traveled to the future and brought designer bags for absolutely no reason. The truth is that we don't know why so many deities of the old world were depicted holding the same thing. It's a mystery that may never be solved. Number 2. Mayan hieroglyphics. Everyone is familiar with the hieroglyphics from Egypt. But did you know that the ancient Maya also used hieroglyphics? In fact, the writing system employed by the ancient Mayans was very similar to what was used in Egypt. The Maya wrote using a system of roughly 800 individual signs and glyphs, drawn out in columns that read from left to right and from top to the bottom. Each word in Mayan represented a word or a syllable, and they could be combined to form any word or concept. These included numbers, names, titles, places, literally anything. The hieroglyphics were often carved in stone or even wood, and they would be found all across the ancient Mayan archaeological sites, written on monuments, on pieces of architecture, and scrawled over walls. The hieroglyphics have even been found on pieces of pottery. The big coincidence here is that the hieroglyphics are so similar to those used in Egypt. How on earth could the Maya civilization have gotten inspired to create their system of writing, which appears to be based on the system of writing used by the Egyptians? Scientists and historians are at an absolute loss. It's such a strong coincidence that it would be as if a small village in China began to write in Latin 5,000 years ago without ever meeting the Romans. It just doesn't make any sense. Number 1. Hinduism in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians were doing things way before Hinduism really became popular. But why does it seem like the Egyptian creation legend is based on the Hindu creation myth? Historians don't know. But there are an awful lot of coincidences between how Egyptians believed they came into being and how the Hindus believe they came into the universe. In both Egyptian religion and Hinduism, before the universe was ever created, there existed only primordial water and no light and no movement. The Egyptians actually feared the world would fall back into this state of darkness. This is why they developed a cult based on worshipping solar deities. If the sun failed to rise one day, Egypt would fall into darkness and chaos. The Hindus believed in something quite similar. They thought the Earth was only going to last for 4 million years, at the end of which the universe would be destroyed and everything would fall back into the primordial waters. The similarities here are that both religions feared the world falling into primordial darkness before the universe. Only the Hindus had an actual date that it would happen. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about the link between ancient cultures? Number 10. Macrodactyly. Macrodactyly is defined by abnormally large fingers and toes, caused by an overgrowth of bone and soft tissue. It's something people are born with and usually occurs in one hand or foot, with the oversized appendage getting even bigger as the person grows. That means even as adults, they'll have mismatched hands or feet with distressing results. Nobody knows what causes the condition, which is not hereditary and does not result from the mother's habits during pregnancy. Theories point towards an abnormal blood supply or defective nerves, but there's no solid proof to back any of these claims. While macrodactyly is considered benign, having a massive couple of fingers or toes can be pretty detrimental to someone's quality of life. Consider, for example, Lia Hua, a man who was once known for having the world's largest hand. When he was hospitalized in 2007, his left index finger measured nearly a foot or 30 centimeters long, and his middle finger was around 6 inches or 15 centimeters long. The man's entire left arm weighed roughly 22 pounds or 10 kilograms. By the time he turned 24, Hua's gargantuan fingers had finally stopped growing, qualifying him for corrective plastic surgery. He underwent a 7-hour operation to reduce the size of his fingers and thumb. During the procedure, surgeons removed 11 pounds, more than 5 kilograms of flesh and bone. He wasn't done though. He later had to undergo a second operation to reshape his arm and shoulder. It may be fascinating to look at a person like this, but everyone should appreciate how difficult his life must be with that sort of deformative condition. Number 9. Diprocipice. Sometimes an otherwise normal-looking baby is born with 2 faces, with the extra face being either partial or complete. Known as diprocipice, which is Greek for 2 faces, the condition is considered the result of conjoined twinning and is caused by a protein called SHH, which affects the formation of the embryo's face and skull in the womb. There's no 2 ways about it. These children do look strange, but we should be sensitive since they didn't choose to be born with duplicate features. There are even occasional reports of extra pupils in the eyes of children born with the rare genetic duplication disorders, but these are unconfirmed by the majority of doctors. 1 in every 180,000 to 15 million live births result in this condition, which is known to occur in tandem with other congenital disorders, such as anencephaly, which is when a major portion of the brain is missing, neural tube defects, and heart malformations. Most people with diprocipice are stillborn. In fact, there are only a handful of recorded instances of humans surviving more than minutes past birth with the condition. One of the most famous faces of diprocipice is a boy from Missouri named Trey Johnson. Doctors were sure that he would not live long after birth, but Trey defied the odds and made headlines in 2021 when he turned 17 years old, which is unheard of for someone with his ailment. While it's unknown how long Trey will live, he's already proven to be nothing short of a miracle for surviving as long as he has. Number 8. Progeria. Throughout the world, 1 out of every 8 million children is born with progeria, a debilitating condition that causes children to age far before their time. Also called Hutchinson-Gilford syndrome, this extremely rare genetic disorder becomes evident by the time the child is 2 years old. Most kids with progeria die at around 13 years old, although some live into their 20s, and they usually pass away from a heart attack or a stroke, conditions that typically affect people much older than them. Caused by a genetic mutation affecting the protein that supports a cell's nucleus, progeria is characterized by symptoms like baldness, a disproportionately large head with a small face, bone abnormalities, and growth impairment. Sadly, there is no cure for this condition, which is rarely hereditary but instead tends to appear randomly. Parents who have a child with progeria are highly unlikely to have another who suffers from it. Genetics experts hope to learn more about the connection between DNA and the aging process by studying this mystifying ailment. Number 7. Hypertrochosis. Nicknamed werewolf syndrome, hypertrichosis is an extremely rare condition that involves excess body and facial hair growth. It affects both men and women, but only 1 in a billion people have it. Only 50 cases have ever been documented since the Middle Ages, making this one of the rarest conditions ever. Hypertrichosis can be present at birth or appear over time, and it occurs in two different forms. Generalized hypertrichosis affects the whole body, while localized hypertrichosis only occurs in a certain area. There's also congenital hypertrichosis, which is genetic, and acquired hypertrichosis, which is caused by certain medications. Acquired hypertrichosis can usually be reversed by stopping the use of whatever medication is causing it, but there's no cure for the congenital version of this disorder, leaving the sufferer with no choice but to either live with the excess hair or spend copious amounts of time and effort removing it. Sadly, the effects of this condition are mostly psychological. A person can certainly live with having hair in unusual places, but the appearance that comes with hypertrichosis often leads to social isolation, alienation, and bullying, leaving deep emotional scars and trauma. Unable to blend in with mainstream society, people with werewolf syndrome have occasionally found work in circus sideshows in the past, though they probably wouldn't consider that to be a particularly glamorous or enjoyable life. Number 6. Unatan Syndrome. Proposed by Turkish evolutionary biologist Unatan in 2005, Unatan Syndrome is a controversial condition that allegedly causes humans to walk on all fours and exhibit noticeably primate-like behaviors, as well as impaired cognitive function. Tan's suggestions came after he observed the Ulas family, who used primitive speech, suffered from a congenital brain disability, and walk with quadrupedal locomotion, in other words, on all fours. People with this condition also tend to have a diminished perception of space and time, and are unable to communicate effectively. Unatan boldly claimed that the syndrome represents a backward step in evolution. A 2010 study found that people who suffer from the condition tend to be from incestuous families, indicating that Unatan syndrome is passed on through a recessive gene. But the scientists who performed the research admitted that there may not be one single causal factor. It's also possible that different combinations of genetic flaws manifest as Unatan syndrome. But without knowing exactly what causes it, it's extremely difficult for professionals to detect and diagnose. Moreover, more research is necessary for experts to learn how to best treat the condition. What do you think is behind Unatan syndrome? Could it be a step backwards in human evolution, or is it caused by exposure to toxic chemicals, or something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, then remember to subscribe to Talltanic for more intense videos if you haven't subscribed already. Number 5. Epidermodysplasia verruciformis. Also known as tree man syndrome, this strange illness is a hereditary skin disorder that makes a person highly susceptible to human papilloma, HPV, infections, which look like tree bark growing from the body, particularly on the hands, feet, and other areas that are most exposed to the sun. Eventually, the sufferer becomes covered in the warts and scaly growths. Symptoms typically emerge for the first time between the ages of 20 and 40, according to Gizmodo. There's no known cure for tree man syndrome, and the world at large didn't know about it until 2007, when footage detailing the life of a 32-year-old Indonesian man named Dede Kaswara surfaced online. After first experiencing symptoms as a teenager, Dede lost his job, his wife left him, and he was increasingly alienated by his neighbors and society in general. In 2008, he underwent surgery to remove 13 pounds or 6 kilograms of his growths in hopes of living a better life. Rahmat Denata, the doctor who performed the surgery, told the Los Angeles Times that Dede would never be fully cured, but that he could now enjoy some semblance of normalcy. The man was able to do things he couldn't do before, including many tasks we take for granted every day that require the use of our hands, like eating, writing, and using a cell phone. Before the surgery, Dede had been admitted to the hospital with a lung infection caused by the growths, indicating that it was time to do something about his affliction. Sadly, the effects of tree man syndrome ultimately caused more health problems, which claimed Dede's life in 2016. He was just 44 years old. Number 4. Ectodactyly. A person who suffers from ectodactyly, also called split hand, split foot malformation, SHFM, or cleft hand or foot, is typically missing one or more of their middle digits on their hand and or feet. This congenital disorder affects the development of these appendages, leaving those afflicted with claw-like feet and hands that often contain just one thumb and one finger, hence the condition's nickname, lobster claw syndrome. In addition to an array of rare limb deformities, ectodactyly often comes with hearing loss. The condition is caused by several factors associated with chromosome 7, but it's not fully understood by experts. While there are certainly setbacks to having ectodactyly, in many cases people can live at least relatively normal lives. Take, for instance, actress and former television anchor Bree Walker, who appeared on Nip Tuck. She has enjoyed a successful career despite any obstacles she faces due to having ectodactyly. But, as Walker knows, the condition can be passed down from parents to their children. She still had 2 kids, knowing about the 50-50 chance that this would happen, and both children were born with ectodactyly. Some people criticized Walker's decision to become a mother because of the deformity's hereditary tendencies, but she defended her choice both in real life and on screen, when she played a character who said, "Ultimately, I decided they have every right to be here and to be different." And she has a perfectly valid point. In some cases, medical experts have even managed to correct the deformities well enough to defeat its hindering effects. Boston-based plastic surgeon Dr. Joseph Upton made a groundbreaking accomplishment in this regard when he replaced some of the missing fingers of a pair of 2-year-old girls with some of their toes, creating thumbs that had some movement and sensation, greatly enhancing their quality of life. Number 3. Trimethylamineuria. It's unknown how many people suffer from trimethylamineuria, an astonishingly rare condition that renders the body incapable of breaking down the pungent-smelling chemical compound trimethylamine. As a result, the individual emanates an odor that's been described as resembling rotting fish, rotten eggs, garbage, or urine. That's right, they have incredibly horrifying body odor, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. Just be grateful it isn't you, and be kind if you ever meet a person with this. The smell results from the buildup of trimethylamine in the person's body, which causes it to seep out of their sweat, urine, and breath. For obvious reasons, the condition tends to affect an individual's life in almost every way imaginable, including their relationships, job, and social life, often leading to isolation and depression. Trimethylamineuria is caused by mutations in the FMO3 gene, which provides the instructions for breaking down trimethylamine. Produced by intestinal bacteria when the body digests eggs, liver, fish, and legume proteins, trimethylamine is typically converted into an odorless compound. But without the proper genes for it, a person has no choice but to live with the odorific results. Scientists are still learning about this extremely seldom seen condition, but they believe that it is mostly hereditary, and that it's passed down by 2 parents who both possess the genetic mutation associated with trimethylamineuria. It can also be caused by an excess of certain proteins in someone's diet, an abnormal increase in bacteria that produce trimethylamine, and by kidney or liver disease. The severity of symptoms varies, with some individuals giving off a slight odor, with others struggling with a stronger smell. Researchers believe that stress exacerbates the symptoms. Number 2. Fatal familial insomnia. The rare degenerative brain disorder is one of the most terrifying diseases a person can have. Also known as fatal familial insomnia, FFI, it often starts with mild difficulties falling and staying asleep. Other symptoms include double vision, involuntary eye movements, tremors, slurred speech, and difficulty swallowing. A true sufferer of the condition will experience progressively worsening physical and mental symptoms that eventually lead to death. During the disease's progression, a person's nervous system will likely endure a disruption of involuntary functions, like regulating body temperature and heart rate, as well as sweating and breathing. What little sleep a sufferer does get is often accompanied by extremely lucid dreams. Sleep deprivation takes a devastating toll on the human mind and body, eventually leading to coma and death. The initial insomnia often begins when an individual is middle-aged, but can happen earlier or later on in life, and is followed by the person getting almost no sleep, with the condition typically worsening dramatically over a months-long period. An abnormal variant in the prion-related protein, or PRPN gene, is almost always what causes FFI, although the condition also occurs randomly according to the National Organization of Rare Disorders. The resulting abnormally shaped proteins are toxic, and they accumulate within the thalamus of the brain, resulting in the progressive loss of nerve cells and the symptoms that go along with it. Sleeping pills won't help, and people who suffer from this disease are left to suffer as their brains stop being able to repair themselves. Sadly, there is no cure for FFI. Researchers are currently working to figure out how to best treat and manage the condition. Number 1. Polymelia. Humans and animals can be affected by polymelia, or excess limbs. In most cases of people, an individual with the condition has at least 5 limbs, and the extra limbs are usually deformed or shrunken. This sometimes happens as a result of an embryo that started as conjoined twins, one of which degenerated, leaving only their partially developed limbs behind. One extreme form of the condition, known as Diprocipice deformity, occurs when the body's lower abdomen forks, usually resulting in 2 sets of legs and 2 pelvises. There are other types of polymelia, including cephalomelia, which is characterized by an extra limb protruding from the head, pyromelia, an extra limb attached to the pelvis, thoracomelia, an extra limb in the midsection, and notomelia, an extra limb attached to the back. Genetic factors such as mutations and improper cell division can cause polymelia. Exposure during pregnancy to dangerous infectious and chemical agents and medications can also lead to the condition. Polymelia is almost always detectable before birth through ultrasounds, and in some cases can be treated through orthopedic surgery, removing the extra limbs. Number 10. The oldest weapons. The oldest known weapons in the world are javelins, which are essentially spears made with carved stone tips for impaling. These super ancient weapons were recently discovered in Ethiopia and date back 280,000 years. The reason this could change history is that they predate the earliest known fossil of Homo sapiens, also known as human beings, by roughly 80,000 years. Plus, these newly discovered weapons are at least 200,000 years older than any other similar weapons found. What this suggests is that our ancient ancestors, the species that predated our own, figured out how to make complex throwing projectiles. You could almost think of it like if monkeys started using weapons and fashioning knives. Sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie like Planet of the Apes. That's how huge this discovery is. The stone tools were found on the site of a collapsed volcanic crater in Ethiopia's Rift Valley, an area which scientists believe was the original cradle of civilization. Between 125,000 and 780,000 years ago, the area would have been on the shores of a huge megalake, where hippos and other wild animals congregated. According to National Geographic, the researchers found at least 141 obsidian artifacts here, all of which were spear tips. Before now, researchers thought Homo sapiens were the ones who learned how to use projectile weapons. But now it looks like they were being used for tens of thousands of years previously. The reason this is such an important discovery is that crafting projectiles empowered the first human hunters to strike from a distance, therefore giving us our first and most important advantage over other species. That stone javelin, 280,000 years ago, would turn a rock into a sling, an arrow, and eventually a bullet. Number 9. Neolithic history. Scientists have discovered some unique artifacts in Papua New Guinea that could be rewriting the Neolithic history on the island. About 10,000 years before today, the climate on Earth changed. It became a lot easier to plant crops. This initiated a Neolithic revolution all across the globe. The ability to plant crops and stop being nomadic is what resulted in the first societies of Europe and Asia, as people began staying in one area and farming. For a long time, scientists have been under the assumption that certain areas of the world never experienced this blossoming of society, such as Papua New Guinea. But new artifacts discovered are actually suggesting that the people here began to farm, craft tools, and partake in arts and crafts at the same time as the people in Europe and Asia. According to archaeologist Ben Shaw from the University of New South Wales, the local early cultures of Papua New Guinea planted a wide variety of crops, including yams and bananas. In 2016, researchers found a whole stash of amazing artifacts, including stone pestles, tools for lighting fires, and even a carved stone face. These artifacts are between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, suggesting there may have been a highly advanced island culture living on Papua New Guinea, which could have rivaled the earliest civilizations anywhere in Europe or Asia. It's not clear exactly what may have happened to this civilization, or where the rest of these artifacts are hidden, but this is definitely changing the way historians see the small, isolated island and its people. Number 8. Amazon warrior woman. Researchers at a small museum inside of the University of Mississippi were shocked when they recently discovered the figure of an ancient Amazon woman painted on the side of a cylindrical box dating back 2,500 years. The box was once used for keeping cosmetics and jewelry. The image shows a female warrior on horseback, armed with a lasso and a battle axe. The Amazon is fighting a Greek enemy soldier who tries to avoid the Amazon's attacks by ducking behind his shield. But what's really shocking about the image is that, according to scholar Adrian Mayer, it's the first ancient artistic image of an Amazon woman using a lasso in battle. It really makes you wonder where they got the idea for Wonder Woman and her lasso, right? Adrian also said that the image on the box gives some previously unknown information on the females of the day, as it suggests women enjoyed scenes in which powerful Amazons bested Greek warrior men. It could be that since the box was used probably to keep makeup, ancient Athenian women thought of themselves as Amazons in a way, as they prepared themselves for the arduous day to come. The image was painted on the box in Athens sometime between 480 and 450 BCE, but it has more serious implications than just supporting a positive self-image for women. It also means that whoever painted the picture was aware of the ancient Scythians and their warrior women who rode horses into battle and carried lassos. Number 7. Story of Goliath. Ancient structures recently discovered by the Philistine city of Gath are changing the way experts and historians see the Bible, and specifically the story of Goliath. It now seems that the giant man may have indeed come from an even more giant city. This is because the remains of supersized structures and fortifications have been found in Gath during an archaeological project. Up until now, most of the excavations at Gath revealed artifacts only from between the 10th and 9th centuries BCE. But this newest excavation revealed a whole unexplored layer of the city dating back to the 11th century BCE, which fits perfectly with the biblical narrative that King-to-be David defeated the giant Goliath in that same century. Finding structures dating back to this time is important because it confirms the chronology of the kings of Israel and their descriptions in the Bible. And if David really did fight a giant enemy, he would have done so over 3,000 years ago when the city was a great and powerful capital with walls, tall structures, and a thriving population. Though, unfortunately, no giant skulls have been found just yet. If Goliath was truly a giant, as the story says, his remains have never been excavated. Number 6. The Hammer of Thor. Thor's hammer goes much further back than the Marvel comics. In Norse mythology, Thor used his hammer to prevent the giants from destroying Asgard, where he and the other gods lived. The story of Thor and his hammer inspired the Vikings to wear runes and charms for protection. To date, researchers have found thousands of small amulets all over Viking territory. These amulets are known as Torshammer. But researchers, although they believed the amulets to be representations of Thor's hammer, were not 100% sure. It wasn't until just recently, when archaeologists unearthed a Torshammer on a small Danish island, that they got some much-needed answers. The artifact was discovered on the Danish island of Lolland. What made it so unique was that it was found with an inscription that read Hammer X is, which of course translated to "This is a hammer." There's no more doubt about it. The amulets were depictions of hammers. Even more fascinating is that according to Peter Pence with the National Museum of Denmark, the Vikings used these hammers for their protective powers. And then during the rise of Christianity, they began wearing hammers and crosses mixed together for double protection. Number 5. Egypt's wetter climate. A mummified shrew found in Egypt has shed some light on what the country looked like just a few thousand years ago. The remains of the shrew were found at a burial site in Kiesna, inside the Falcon Necropolis. Over 2,000 years ago, the Egyptians were mummifying and preserving animals of all kinds inside the necropolis, shrews being just one example. But what's really amazing is that a lot of the animals here no longer exist in Egypt. According to Neil Woodman with the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, studying the mummies left behind in this place can show how the environment has changed and what its effects have been on the animals that used to live in Egypt. The shrew is only found today in moist places. This is an animal that does not like living in the desert. It prefers moist wetlands. But that explains why it was found in the necropolis. Scientists have suggested that 2,000 years ago, Egypt was significantly wetter than it is today. This means it hosted a more diversified portfolio of wildlife. It's not exactly clear how Egypt got so dry so quickly, or what animals may have had to do with it, but understanding that Egypt was actually a wetland and not a desert can help change people's false image of this ancient kingdom. Number 4. New author of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In one of the most shocking discoveries of 2021, a second author of the Dead Sea Scrolls has been discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in case you didn't know, were found in the late 1940s in Israel and consist of over 900 manuscripts, the oldest remaining physical texts from the Hebrew Bible, dating back to between the 4th century BCE and the 2nd century AD. As you can probably imagine, the authors of the manuscripts did not leave their names on the scrolls, but it was kind of assumed that if somebody wrote one of the manuscripts, they did so themselves. But a new study using artificial intelligence has shown subtle differences in the handwriting of one of the scripts. It shows that it was written by at least 2 scribes, although their handwriting is so similar that it's impossible to tell the difference with the naked eye. What this means is that the scribes were probably receiving training at the exact same school or as part of some kind of secret cult. The newest discovery has opened up a universe of possibilities. Researchers are now closer to discovering why the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in the first place and who exactly was behind it. If these scribes were indeed trained to write the scrolls, just which secret organization trained them to do so? Do you have any theories on who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? What do you think was behind them? Tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. Then remember to subscribe to Talltanic if you haven't already for more intense videos. Number 3. Europeans in Alaska. Archaeologists working in the Alaskan Arctic may have just discovered artifacts that predate Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World. This discovery is controversial and hasn't really been discussed in professional circles. This is because changing history is hard, and nobody wants to rewrite the history books, even if that very history proves to be wrong. Here's the deal. Blue beads from Europe were recently found in Alaska. The beads are roughly the size of blueberries and were created in Venice, Italy during the 15th century. The beads would have been traded to the east, probably to somewhere in Central Asia along the Silk Road. But then, things get weird. Somehow the beads would have continued going east, probably all the way to Beijing and then beyond across the Bering Strait to Alaska. There are a few issues with the story. Firstly, Elliot Blair from the University of Alabama says that Europeans weren't making beads like this before Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492. He says the glass beads wouldn't have been made until the 16th or 17th century. But despite this, even if the beads arrived in Alaska in the 17th century, they still predate European contact with the natives in Alaska. This suggests that it was actually the Asians living in eastern Russia who met the Alaskan indigenous people first, and maybe even had a trade route established with them. Even if the glass beads didn't end up in Alaska until much later, native Siberians probably had contact with those living in North America far before Christopher Columbus ever showed up with his crew and brought such a massive change into the world. What do you think? Do you think that the Yupik people of Siberia might have known the Inuit of Alaska back in the 16th century? Number 2. Biblical archaeology. It's said that the Bible spans 1,400 years of real history. However, some have estimated the Bible actually goes back over 4,000 years. According to Professor Tom Meyer, the Bible and its mysteries can be unraveled by using archaeology. It turns out that archaeology and the Bible may go hand in hand. One of the most powerful examples of how archaeology can confirm the characters from the Bible came in 1933, when a British excavation in the ancient city of Jericho unveiled artifacts that may have belonged to King Eglon of Moab. described in the Book of Judges as the ruler of the Moab society, who teamed up with Ammon and Amalek to attack Israel. There are lots of figures in the Bible that nobody thinks really existed, and yet it seems archaeology is able to change our historical view of the people and events in the book. But what's really strange and more unexplainable than anything is how exactly the Bible was put together over such a long course of time. If the Bible really does span almost 2,000 years of history, who continued writing the book throughout all that time? Or if it was written to include 2,000 years of previous history, what ancient historian was able to track down all of that knowledge in a time when many places on the planet hardly had a system for writing? Unfortunately, this is something scientists can't figure out. What do you think? Number 1. African coins. According to the recorded history of Australia, the first foreigners to step foot on the continent were European. The first Dutchman arrived in 1606, and then Captain James Cook claimed the continent in 1770 for the British Empire. But a couple of strange artifacts recently discovered may be flipping that history on its head. The coins were minted by an Islamic civilization no longer around today. The coins were commissioned by the ruler of ancient Kilwa, in what is today Tanzania. They date back to the year 900. Suggesting it may have been Arabs instead of Europeans who first stepped foot in Australia. Unfortunately, nobody has found the ruins of an ancient settlement or anything else to suggest early visitors. It could also be that sailors from Africa arrived in Australia, traded some coins to the local indigenous people, then vanished and never found their way back. We don't actually know for certain how the coins ended up on Australian soil, but experts are fairly positive that they were there way before anyone from Europe ever landed. Do you think archaeology can change history as we know it? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and come back again for another fantastic video.